Episode 1. The Blessing Ceremony. They dressed us in white because it made the blood easier to see. 7 children stood barefoot on the salt-scarred stones of the chapel courtyard, heads bowed under the heavy gaze of the village. The sky above was a flat sheet of iron, and the sea beyond the cliffs heaved and groaned, as if already reaching for us. I was the last in line, the smallest, the loudest, and they hated me for it. The priest, Father Corvin, moved down the line, a crooked shadow in robe stitched with barnacles and prayer. In one hand, he held the chalice of brine. In the other, a crooked staff crowned with the vertebrae of something dredged from the trench beyond the reef. One by one, he pressed a wet thumb against the forehead of each child, muttering blessings under his breath. Salt to salt, flesh to sea, soul to silence. The villagers chanted back, their voices brittle as dried reeds. When Father Corvin reached me, he paused. His thumb hovered over my brow, trembling. He knew. They all did. I did not kneel. I stared up at him, my throat dry, my heart a hammer in my chest. Somewhere behind him, my mother wept into her hands. Somewhere further back, the Bishop of Tides watched with hooded eyes, the rings on his fingers glinting like teeth. "Kneel, child," Father Corvin rasped. The wind howled between the broken arches of the chapel. The waves shattered themselves against the cliffs below, and I did not kneel. Instead, I spoke the words that would damn us all. "I won't drown for you." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Father Corvin's face twisted, not in anger, but in fear. The bishop stepped forward, his voice calm, syrupy sweet. "The blessing is not a choice, dear one. It is a gift, an honor." Behind him, the salt statues of the previous generation stood in silent witness. Children preserved in salt, their mouths open in frozen screams, their hands reaching out to sky that had never answered. A gift, an honor, a lie. The villagers surged forward, rough hands grabbing my arms, my hair, my legs. I kicked. I screamed. I bit down on a hand that tried to cover my mouth. But it was no use. 7 children must go. 7 statues must stand. The pact must be honored. They dragged us to the edge of the cliffs where the rocks were slick with old blood and older salt. Below, the sea roared, a mouth waiting to devour. Father Corvin raised the chalice high. "By the covenant of the deep, by the blood of the chosen, by the salt that binds," he began. I twisted in their grip, my bare feet scrambling against the stones. "We offer our young, our pure, our beloved." The bishop raised his arms, his smile a rictus of sanctified horror, "so that we may endure another season of life." They threw the first child. A splash, a silence, the second, the third. The ocean swallowed them whole. When they came for me, I laughed so hard it ripped the ceremony apart, shattered the careful rhythm of sacrifice. "You think the sea forgets?" I screamed, thrashing against the arm that held me. But the sea remembers everything. The last thing I saw before they hurled me into the abyss was a statue of my sister, salt-crusted, eyeless, mouth open in an endless, soundless scream. Then the water closed over my head. Cold, crushing, final, but I did not drown. I sank deeper than the others, past the bones of old offerings, past the twisted ruins of ships and churches dragged under by tides unseen. And something found me there, something older than the bishop's prayers, something hungrier than the ocean itself. It whispered to me through the blackness, "Not yet, little one, not yet." And I opened my eyes in the dark. Episode 2. The drowned girl walks. The villagers lit candles for 7. 7 names whispered into salt. 7 souls carried by the tide. They rang the bells until their hands bled, believing the ritual had closed the wound, stitched the bargain tight for another year. They were wrong. The night after the blessing ceremony, the mist rolled in thicker than any the village had ever seen. Heavy, salt-sweet, clinging to the skin like a second, colder breath. At first, they thought it was grief, a trick of tired eyes, guilt made flesh, until the bells began to ring on their own. Father Corvin was the first to hear it. A low, wet sound dragging itself up the chapel steps. His heart stuttered, his mouth shaped prayers he had long forgotten how to mean. He stepped into the fog, and there I was, standing barefoot in the center of the courtyard, dripping black seawater, my white gown clinging to my bones like a shroud. Alive, but not untouched, not unchanged. My skin shimmered with a thin crust of salt that cracked with every movement. My hair hung heavy and dark around my face, framing eyes that no longer belonged to any child of the land. They had thrown me to the sea. The sea had thrown me back. Father Corvin stumbled backward, tripping over the hem of his robe. "Bless one," he croaked, his voice splintering on the edges of terror. You are saved." I tilted my head, slow and mechanical, like a puppet finding its strings had been rewired. "Saved," I whispered, my voice a rasp torn from the depths where light does not go. Behind me, the mist shifted. Shapes moved in it, shambling, broken shapes, half seen and wholly wrong. The other 6, the ones who had drowned properly, the ones who should have been silent, they moved now, not as children, not as saints, but as something new, something remade. The villagers gathered, torches trembling in their hands, faces stretched tight with a terror too vast to scream. The Bishop of Tide stepped forward, his robes dripping with false sanctity. "This is a test," he declared, voice booming through the heavy air. "A trial sent by the deep to test our faith." I smiled, a slow, salt-slick smile that cracked the delicate mask of flesh across my face. "No," I said, "this is your debt come calling." The ground beneath their feet began to hiss, the moisture in the stones pulling itself upward, weeping through the cracks, soaking the courtyard in a slow tide of blackened brine. One by one, the torches sputtered out, the flames devoured by the wet, suffocating air. The bishop turned, barking orders, but the mist swallowed his words. The statues of the past generations, those poor salt-crowned children, began to weep, not water, not blood, but salt, thick rivers of it, running from their hollow eyes, pooling around their stone feet, dragging the memories of every broken promise, every drowned prayer into the open. The villagers fled. Father Corvin fell to his knees, clutching his beads so hard they cracked in his hands. "Mercy," he whispered. I stepped closer, the salt hissing where my bare feet touched the stones. "You knew," I said, my voice low and sure, carrying over the shrieking wind. "You knew the sea did not forgive." I reached out. Father Corvin flinched, but I did not touch him. I simply let the salt do what it had come to do. It reached for him, slow and inevitable, seeping into his skin, turning his tears to crystals, his breath to brittle frost. He screamed only once, short, sharp, quickly swallowed, and then he was a statue, a new sentinel for the cursed coastline, a warning written in bone and brine. The others watched, frozen in terror. I turned to them, the mist coiling at my feet, the drowned children stirring behind me like a coming tide. This village was built on salt and lies, I said. Now it will be reclaimed. And as the bells rang madly overhead, a sound not of salvation but of reckoning, the first of the villagers dropped their torches and fled into the night, only to find that the mist was waiting for them there, too. The seer remembers. The debt must be paid, and I had come to collect. Episode 3. Salted Saints. The statues began to crack at dawn. At first, it was just a sound, a soft, splintering noise, like ice shifting on a black river. The villagers who had survived the night, huddled in their shuttered homes, clutching salt-crusted relics and whispering broken prayers, heard it rising from the courtyard of St. Braden's Chapel. They dared not look. They prayed instead, mouthing the old hymns their fathers had taught them, songs meant to bind the sea, to soothe the hunger of the deep. But it was too late for hymns, too late for hope. I stood in the center of the courtyard, watching the statues, the salt-encrusted children, those poor offerings from decades past, stood silent in the mist, their faces twisted in agony and reverence. Their outstretched arms pointed not toward heaven, but toward the endless gray mouth of the sea. And now they were breaking. A fine web of cracks spidered across their bodies, glistening with wetness as the mist kissed their wounds. Salt flaked away from hollow eyes. Fingers snapped like brittle twigs. The first to fall was Samuel. He had been one of the blessed 15 years ago, a boy with a broken foot who had been promised healing, if only he would walk willingly into the tide. He had walked. He had drowned. And now, as his salt shell split down the center, something stepped out of ruins of his martyrdom. It wore Samuel's face, but stretched and wrong, paler than bone, eyes too large, mouth trembling with something that was not breath. The crowd screamed. Some ran. Some fell to their knees. Some simply collapsed, curling in on themselves like leaves curling under frost. More statues cracked. From every salt shell emerged a figure, not quite dead, not quite alive, bodies sculpted by the sea's bitter mercy, souls hollowed and filled with something hungrier than forgiveness. The salted saints. Once they had been children. Once they had dreamed of growing older, of walking the cliffs without fear. Now they moved in perfect silence, their feet dragging through mist, their hands reaching out, not to bless, but to bind. The Bishop of Tide staggered into the courtyard, his robe still dripping with rain and ruin. His face, once carved with the authority of false gods, now sagged with disbelief. "This is not the will of the deep," he cried. I turned to him, my gown whipping around my legs like a tattered banner. "No," I said, my voice low and sure. "This is the will of the drowned." The salted saints moved as one, closing the distance between themselves and the bishop. He tried to run. He tried to pray. Neither saved him. They reached him, their pale fingers threading into his robes, his flesh, his soul. He screamed, a sound so pure, so desperate, it seemed to shake the mist itself. And when he fell silent, there was nothing left of him but a hollowed husk, a salt-stiffened relic, another offering laid at the feet of a tide that would not be turned back. The villagers watched with wide, broken eyes. They understood now. The blessing had never been about salvation. It had always been about silence, about feeding the hunger that gnawed beneath the waves. And now that hunger had found a voice, in the cracked throats of the salted saints, in the weeping stones, in the heartbeat of the mist. And in me, I raised my arms. The salted saints turned toward me, their hollow faces brightening, if such a thing could still be called joy. "Come," I said, and they did. We walked together down the salt-slick streets, past the broken homes, past the graves that the sea had left behind, not as mourners, not as pilgrims, but as a new congregation. And behind us, the bells of St. Braden's Chapel began to toll again. This time, no human hands touched the ropes. The sea was ringing them, calling her children home. Episode 4. The Priest's Confession. They found Father Edward half buried in the salt fields behind the chapel, whispering to the bones. He had been missing since the night of the red storm, presumed drowned or devoured like the others. But when they pulled him from the earth, his hands were still pressed in prayer, and his mouth still moved, shaping words not meant for the living. They dragged him into the chapel and chained him to the stone pulpit, the very place he had once preached the sanctum of the sea. He did not fight. He only wept. When I entered, the villagers parted like waves. Their eyes never met mine now. Some had begun calling me Brineborn. Others simply called me her. But Edric, he looked up, and he smiled. "You came back wrong," he said softly. "So did the truth," I replied. The chapel was cold. The mist had seeped into its walls. The icons had grown soft and strange, faces of saints melting into something fish-eyed and monstrous. I stepped toward the pulpit. "You will speak, Father," I said. "You will speak of the first blessing, of how this bargain was made." His eyes trembled, and then he began to confess. "There was no famine," he said, "no plague, no divine vision. There was only the storm. 300 years ago, the sea rose and swallowed half the village. The dead bloated the shores for weeks. We burned through the last of the grain. We buried our faith with the drowned. And then he came." I said nothing, but I felt in the air, the tightening, the remembering. "A man," Father Edric continued, his voice thin and shaking, or something like a man. "He came from the sea during the night, naked and blind, dragging behind him a net filled not with fish, but with screaming bones. He walked straight into the chapel, still dripping with salt, and spoke in a voice that made the stones weep. He said he would protect the village, feed it, spare it, but only if we made an altar beneath the water and sealed it with the blood of children. Gasps broke through the silence. Someone dropped to their knees. Someone else fled. I stood very still. They agreed, he said, closing his eyes. The priests, the elders, even the mothers. 7 children, once a generation, drowned in the name of the Deep One. They carve his name into the rock beneath the chapel. I have seen it. I have touched it. I have heard it whisper back. He opened his eyes and looked at me, a sick reverence blooming in his voice. And now you are his mouth, aren't you? I stepped closer. No, I said, I am his silence. I turned to the gathered villagers, raising my voice over the wailing wind. You built your peace on our bones. You called it faith. You called it tradition. You called it holy. I pointed to the priest, chained to the pulpit that had once crowned him holy. But he knew. Salt began to rise from the ground. It poured from the cracks between the stones. It spilled from the mouths of the icons. It leaked from the very eyes of those who had stayed silent too long. The sea had heard the confession, and it was not in the mood to forgive. Father Edda began to scream, not from pain, but from rapture. He is coming back, he cried, the one beneath the tides. He's heard your voice again. The pact is broken. He will walk. Salt consumed him. It crawled up his body like a crown, like a blessing, like a grave. In moments, he was a monument of crystal white, still kneeling, still smiling. I faced the crowd. You want to survive? I said, then bury your altars, burn your saints, dig your fingers into the wounds of this village, and do not stop until you feel rot. He is coming, and this time he will not walk alone. Episode 5. The rot beneath the altar. They said no one returned from beneath the chapel. They were wrong. They returned, but not as themselves. The old stories whispered of stone staircases that vanished in fog, of roots that bled brine, of whispers in the dark that learned your name before you were born. But I didn't care about stories anymore. I cared about the truth. And the truth was buried in the crypt beneath the altar, the place where the first priest made the pact and the village lost its soul. We opened the altar at dawn. It took 3 men and 2 hammers to crack the salt seal slab. Beneath it was a staircase made of black coral, slick with years of condensation and rot. The air that rose from it smelled like dead hymns and wet teeth. Only 4 of us descended. Me, a fisherman who had lost 3 daughters to the blessing, a midwife who had once delivered a stillborn and heard it gasp salt before dying again, and a boy, no more than 12, who claimed to have dreamed of the Deep One every night since his sister drowned. We didn't speak. There was no need. The steps coiled downward like a spine, curving deep in the earth should allow. The walls pulsed with something faintly warm, as if the chapel had a heartbeat, or something beneath it did. As we moved deeper, the darkness thickened, not emptiness, but presence. It watched, and it remembered. The midwife was the first to cry out. She fell to her knees, clutching her stomach, weeping and laughing. He's speaking through my womb, she gasped. He's giving it back, my son, he's giving him back. Salt poured from her mouth, from her eyes, from the places where birth and death blur. She collapsed in a pool of brine, and the salt hardened around her like a shell. We left her behind. You do not try to carry what the sea has claimed. Far below, the coral turned to bone. The walls were etched with carvings, crude and ancient, showing men kneeling before a great mouth in the sea. The mouth did not have teeth. It had children, hundreds of them, all wailing, all reaching back for their mothers as the tide pulled them in. The fisherman began to tremble. It wasn't a bargain, he whispered. It was a feeding ritual, and we called it holy. Then we found the door, a circular stone slab sealed with human teeth, arranged in the shape of a weeping sun. The boy stepped forward. It's not locked, he said. It's waiting. He pressed his hand against the center. The door breathed and opened. Inside was a chamber carved from salt and darkness. In the center, a throne, formed not of stone or gold, but of kneeling children, their forms frozen in twisted reverence, their mouths open in silent song. Upon the throne sat a figure, not asleep, not alive. He was the shape of a man, but not its truth. His skin was translucent, threaded with barnacles and scripture. His ribs were open, and inside his chest, where a heart should have been, sat a pearl, black and pulsing. The boy fell to his knees. "It's him," he whispered, "the one beneath." The figure raised his head. His eyes opened, not with anger, with recognition. "You return to me, daughter," he said. His voice was not sound. It was pressure. It filled the chamber like water in lungs. The fisherman screamed. The boy smiled. And I walked forward. "What are you?" I asked. He rose, and the room trembled with his truth. "I am the hunger you called holy. I am the silence behind your psalms. I am the God you made out of fear. And I have waited so long to be worshipped by choice." Episode 6. The bells that never cease. The bells began ringing at midnight. Not once, not thrice, but endlessly. No hands touched the ropes. No priest stood in the tower. Still they rang, low and wet, like bone striking bone inside a coffin long forgotten by the living. The villagers, already hollow from nights of salt and silence, rose from their beds in trembling confusion, and the bells kept ringing. 4 tolls, then 7, then 13, each chime a name, and every name a ghost. I had returned from the depth before the first bell fell, salt still trailing behind me like a veil. The boy walked at my side, eyes vacant, his voice gone since the throne room. The fisherman did not return. The doors of St. Braden's were wide open. No guards, no sermons, only the mist curling across the pews like a second congregation. And at the top of the tower, where the bell cord should have hung limp and frayed, stood a figure no one had seen in years. Sister Mariah. They said she drowned herself a decade ago after losing her 3 sons to the blessing. They said she threw herself into the black waves with her mouth sewn shut. They were right. She stood in the bell tower now, salt white and weeping, her fingers wrapped not around rope, but around air. And still the bell tolled. Each ring of it bent the air, made windows cry salt, made the walls bleed prayers. People fled into the square. Some begged forgiveness. Some screamed. Some dropped to their knees and began chanting the old hymns, desperate to rebind what had already been broken. But no one noticed the statues cracking again, not until they began to move. One by one, the salted saints turned their faces toward the bell tower, and then toward the crowd, and then toward their families. Children whose names have been carved into gravestones. Children who have been buried as offerings, now returning with outstretched arms. But they did not come to embrace. They came to remember, and remembering for them was agony. The first to die was the baker, whose daughter had been the youngest to drown that year. She stepped from the mist, face blank, hair soaked in the salt she'd been baptized in. "Father," she said, voice trembling like the bell's echo, "why didn't you stop them?" He sobbed, reaching for her, and she kissed him, not with lips, with salt, with judgment, with centuries of betrayal hardened into bone. He collapsed, clutching his chest as his blood turned to brine, his breath to dust. By dawn, 20 bells had rung, each one a name, each one a reckoning. I stood at the chapel doors, barefoot on the soaked stone, and I watched. The villagers begged me to stop it. "You came back," they cried. "You were chosen, can't you protect us?" And I said only this: I was chosen to be drowned. Now I choose to watch you remember what you did. A woman, my old teacher, the one who used to slap our hands for asking too many questions, ran up to me, eyes wild. "Elena, please," she gasped. "I prayed for you every night." I looked her in the eye. "Did you scream for me when they tied my hands?" She had no answer, so the bells answered for her. 21, 22, 23, and each toll carried more than sound. It carried truth. The village had built its peace on salt and sacrifice, on obedience, on silence. But the bells had learned to speak, and they would not stop until every secret was dragged into daylight, like a drowned thing clawing its way to shore. I closed my eyes as the sun broke over the eastern cliffs. And still, the bells rang. Episode 7. The first to shatter. They called her Saint Alara, the youngest of first offerings. Only 9 years old when they bound her ankles in coral rope and lowered her into the sea as the tide screamed against the cliffs. The villagers said she never cried. They said she smiled as she sank. So they built a statue for her, the largest, the most ornate, a child in marble and salt, arms open as if welcoming the storm, eyes blank and merciful. For generations, they prayed at her feet, for rain, for crops, for mercy they did not deserve. She never answered, until now, the morning after the bells began their endless toll, her statue cracked, not in a web of fractures, not in a quiet crumble. It split, clean, vertical, violent. From crown to base, a single fissure yawned through the statue's center, and something breathed from within it. The villagers gathered in the square, too afraid to move, too afraid to speak. As salt dust spilled onto stones and the air grew thick with rot, a priest stepped forward, one of the few still alive, his voice trembling with hollowed hope. "She's awakening," he whispered. "Saint Alara is returning to cleanse us." But I knew better. Saints do not return. Not when they were never saints to begin with. Only victims. Only warnings cast in stone. I stood at the edge of the crowd, the mist curling around my legs like loyal dogs, the salted saints watching in silence behind me. And then the statue burst. Not fell, not crumbled, exploded. Salt shrapnel tore through the air, slicing flesh from bone, shredding the banner of the old faith that still hung above the chapel door. And from the hollow stepped her, not Alara, not the child they remembered, but something that wore her shape like a dream gone wrong. Her skin was translucent, threaded with veins of white crystal. Her eyes were two perfect orbs of dry salt, lidless, burning in stillness. Her arms ended in fingers too long, too elegant, dragging along the stone as if remembering what it meant to touch. And on her lips, no smile, only silence, the kind that comes after scream you were never allowed to release. The priest who had spoken stepped toward her, tears flooding his wrinkled face. "Alara," he breathed. "Blessed child, what do you remember?" She tilted her head, and the bones in her neck cracked like old branches. Then she opened her mouth, not to speak, to sing, but the sound. It was not music. It was the echo of a drowning, a long, gurgling note that vibrated the air, the stones, the people's spines. The priest screamed as his eardrums burst. Others fell to ground, clutching their skulls. Some began to bleed from the eyes, whispering her name as if that would save them. I stepped forward. The salted saints moved with me, circling her, not to attack, but to listen, because she was one of them. The first, the memory made flesh. And memories are not kind. She turned her face to mine, her salt-cracked mouth parting in recognition. "He waits," she said, voice brittle, beautiful, wrong. "He dreams still beneath the reef." I nodded. "I know." She extended one hand, palm open, skin flaking like parchment soaked in centuries. "Then walk with me, brine-born." And I took her hand. The villagers watched in horror as we turned from the ruins of their chapel and walked down the blood-slick road together. The girl they drowned, and the girl who came back. Behind us, the bells fell silent for the first time in days, because the one who had learned to ring them was walking again. Episode 8. The Feast of Red Water. They called it a mass, but it wasn't. It was a bargaining. A last, desperate whisper between the damned and the deeper damned. After the shattering of Saint Alara, after her salt song turned bones to dust and prayers to screams, the elders, what few remained, gathered the villagers beneath the moonless sky and told them to prepare for the Feast of Red Water. A cleansing, they said, a way to seal the breach and return to favor. But the ocean does not make deals. Not anymore. Not when blood is already in the water. The altar was rebuilt, not in the chapel, but in the center of the village square. on the very spot where the first child had been drowned 300 years ago. This time, it was not built from stone. It was built from driftwood, bone, and regret. The villagers dressed in robes made of old fishing nets and stitched pages from water-damaged hymnals across their chests. Their eyes were ringed in ash and powder coral. Their mouths, some sewn half shut with eel thread, whispered hymns that tasted like iron and salt. I watched from the edge of the square. Allura stood beside me, silent, unmoving, her cracked skin glowing faintly beneath the red lantern strung between rooftops like fading stars. They had invited us. They had begged us. You are our link to the sea, they said. Intercede. Witness. Forgive. But we came only to watch. Because this was not atonement. This was spectacle. A play of faith performed for a god that had long since gone feral. The mass began at midnight. The tide rose behind them like an audience. The priest, what remained of him, held aloft a cup carved from the jawbone of a drowned sailor. Inside, salted wine and fresh blood, mixed in equal measure. We return to you our offering, he called. May the brine know our names again. From the shadows, they led forth the goats. But the sea does not want goats. So they brought out the pigs. But the sea does not want pigs. So they brought out the children. And the crowd gasped, but did not stop. 2 boys and a girl, no older than 10, stood wide-eyed in net-woven tunics, their cheeks painted with spirals of red clay. They had volunteered. Or so the priest claimed. I saw the tremble in the girl's hands. I stepped forward. But Allura caught my wrist. Let them finish, she whispered. The sea is listening now. The priest raised a cup. His hands shook. His eyes bled tears of salt. We are sorry, he cried to black sky. We are yours. The children were laid on the altar. Knives were raised. And that was when the tide came in. Not with waves. With hands. Long, thin, glistening fingers of salt and sinew rose from the ground. Not from the sea, but from the earth itself. Gripping ankles, wrists, throats. The villagers screamed. The altar split open. And something crawled from within. Not a god. Not a demon. Not a saint. Something remembered. A thing of salt and childhood and hunger. Its face changed constantly. One moment a mother. The next a brother. The next a face you had forgotten but never stopped fearing. It opened its mouth. And the red water came. It poured from the sky. From the wounds. From the mouths of those who once prayed too easily. Rain like blood and salt. Like tears of the unborn. Like penance paid too late. The villagers fell to their knees. Some tried to drink it. Others choked on it. Some simply knelt and let it flood their lungs. By dawn, the square was silent. The altar was gone. The children were gone. Only the red tide remained, lapping at the edges of a village that had run out of lies. Allura turned to me. He is awake now, she said. And we're the only ones who remember why he was sleeping. Episode 9. The Father of the Deep. The sea was silent that morning. Not calm. Silent. The kind of silence that presses against your bones, that hollows out your breath before you even speak, that makes you forget what sound ever meant. I stood at the edge of the world, where the cliffs bled into the water and the red tide had receded, leaving behind a film of crystallized salt like a second skin across the land. Allura knelt beside me. She had not spoken since the feast. There was nothing left to say. We had watched the village try to trade its shame for mercy, and we had watched the sea refuse. Now, something stirred beneath the surface. Not waves, not hunger, but awakening. The mist rolled in slowly, then stopped, suspended midair, as if held back by breath itself. And then the water split, not parted, split, like something rising through a wound in the world. He did not emerge like a beast or crash like a god. He simply appeared, as if he had always been here, as if we were only now learning how to see him. The Father of the Deep. His form was fluid, a silhouette carved from ocean and sorrow. His face flickered between shapes. A child, a woman, a priest, a mother screaming into the tide. And finally, it settled on mine. Clever. I whispered, but unnecessary. The mouth moved, but the voice came from inside me. Inside the salt. Inside the memory. You returned to me, but not in reverence. Why? I stepped forward, barefoot on the bleeding rock, because no one else ever did. The ocean pulsed. You are not the first to resist, but you are the first to come without a knife in your hand. I came with a question. The figure tilted its head, my head, and waited. Why do you need us? I asked, if you are ancient, infinite, hunger without end, why did you ever make a pact with a village so small the stars forgot existed? The air trembled, and the father of the deep laughed, not cruelly, not kindly, just honestly, because you are the only ones who remember me, not with scripture, not with temples, but with fear. And fear is the only prayer I still understand. He stepped closer. Where he walked, the water boiled and healed, bloomed and bled. You call me God, but I was only hunger made holy. I did not demand children. I offered silence. It was you who named the cost. The word struck deeper than any storm. We made you. I breathed. We dressed our own cruelty in your name. He nodded, my face now flickering with the expression of every mother who had ever let go of a child's hand too easily. And now you are the only one asking to unmake me. Can I? No, but you can choose to stop listening. He reached out his hand, my hand, toward me, and if you do, I will go quiet. Not gone, just waiting, as I always have. Behind me, I could feel Oliver trembling, not with fear, but with release. She understood. We all did. The sea had never demanded. We had always been the ones who gave. And now we could choose not to. I stepped back from the edge, and the father of the deep did not follow. He bowed, just once, salt raining from his spine like shattered vows. Then he turned and walked backward into the ocean, never facing away, until the sea closed over him like a promise we no longer needed to keep. Episode 10. The House That Hums. I had not stepped through its door since the night they took my sister. The house stood where I left it, tilted slightly to the left, as if it too had once tried to run. The salt had not spared it. It crusted the window panes like frost, hung in webs from the roof beams, curled between the floorboards like breath, and it was still humming, a low, steady sound, half lullaby, half warning, vibrating through the walls like a memory too large to bury. Oliver did not follow me in. This is yours, she whispered, not mine. I nodded and crossed the threshold barefoot. The hum grew louder and warmer, as if the house remembered my feet, as if it was glad they had come home. I passed the kitchen where my mother used to sing while gutting fish. The knives were still there, still stained, but the fish were gone. I passed the parlor where the village women used to gather after blessings, sipping kelp wine and weaving stories to forget the screams. But it was the stairs that held me. Each step I climbed felt heavier, like climbing back into a dream that had long since turned nightmare. At the top, the hallway tilted to the right, and the hum deepened. It was coming from her room. The door was closed, but the salt had seeped through the cracks, and so had the music. A child's voice, soft and broken, was humming the song we used to sing before the lights went out. Down where the tide pulls dreams to sleep, a cradle sways in waters deep, and if you wake and if you cry, the sea will hush your lullaby. I pushed the door open, and there she was, my sister, or something that wore her skin. She sat on the edge of her old bed, feet not touching the ground, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her hair was damp. Her dress, the same one she wore the night they took her, was dry only in places, as if it had never fully left the water. She looked up at me, eyes black and bottomless, and smiled. You came back late. I said nothing. Words were too small for grief this old. She patted the bed beside her. I've been humming for years. I didn't think you still knew the tune. Were you? I whispered. She tilted her head. I'm the part of you that never stopped waiting. The room pulsed. The wallpaper wept brine. The window fogged with breath not mine. They told me it would be quick, she said. That the sea was kind. That the salt would keep me clean. She smiled again, wider, now too wide. But the sea was lonely, and the salt remembers everything. I stepped forward. I never stopped looking for you. She stood, and when she did, the hum became a scream. Not of rage, not of pain, of recognition. The salt on the walls flared. The house moaned. The floor splintered with old footsteps retraced. She reached for me, and I let her, not because I believed she was real, but because I knew I was. We embraced, and the house exhaled. The hum softened, melted into the walls, the ceiling, the bones of the place. My sister, whatever remained of her, whispered one final thing. You carry the ending, but I was always the beginning. And then she crumbled, not into salt, into light, a soft, pale shimmer of sea glass and lullabies, dissolving into dust that did not sting. I stood alone in the room, but the hum was gone, and the silence, for once, did not feel cruel. Episode 11, The Veil of White Dust. It began with the walls. Paint peeled like shedding skin, revealing not wood, not stone, but salt, a fine white dust that curled from behind crucifixes, spilled from the mouths of saintly icons, and gathered in the corners of homes like the ash of forgotten prayers. The villagers tried to sweep it. They burned sage. They sang hymns. They recited the rites they had learned as children, mouthing them like lifelines. But the dust kept falling, from the ceilings, from the wells, from their own mouths when they coughed in the night. I walked through the village as it turned pale. Every home had begun to look the same, coated in sorrow, silenced by sediment. The salted saints no longer moved. They stood watch at the edges of the roads, not as guardians, not as threats, but as mirrors. Every time someone passed, the statues turned their heads, not to judge, but to reflect, to remind, to remember. The people avoided me now. Even the boldest would not meet my eyes, because I had touched the deep and returned, because I had seen what they buried, and because they were starting to see it too. The rot did not come from the sea. It came from memory. From the years they convinced themselves that children slipping beneath waves were holy, that silence was mercy, that sacrifice was love. And now, the truth had nowhere left to hide. One afternoon, a boy no older than 6 stumbled into the square. His skin was pale, his hair falling out in soft clumps. His hands clutched a withered book of Psalms. One page, I noticed, had been eaten through by mold. He keeps whispering in my dreams, the boy said, voice thin as mist. He asks if I still believe in him. Who? I asked, though I already knew. The boy smiled, wide and cracked. The God we made out of fear. He fell forward into my arms, and when I caught him, his body burst into white dust. Not ash, not salt. Belief decaying. That night, the chapel collapsing on itself. No wind, no fire, just a quiet implosion, like a breath held too long finally released. The bells didn't toll. The ropes had turned to thread. The tower had gone soft. Only the silence remained. And the dust, thick, slow, falling like snowfall in a place that had never known winter. By morning, most homes had no doors, no windows, no separation from the outside world at all, as if the village itself was surrendering, not to me, not to the sea, but to the weight of what it had always been. A veil, drawn tight between horror and hope. And now, unraveling one thread at a time, I stood in the square, barefoot in the white dust, and I spoke aloud, not to the villagers, but to the thing beneath the reef, and to the child still humming in my bones. What survives when belief dies? No voice answered, only the wind and the slow collapse of every lie that had kept the village upright. Episode 12, The False Baptism. They came for me before dawn, faces covered in linen soaked with vinegar and ash, hands trembling with faith too old to question. Eyes filled not with hatred, but with hope, desperate hope. You were the first to be spared, they said, and so you must be the last to be offered. They bound my wrists with kelp-stained rope. They tied salt stones to my ankles. A ritual born not of scripture, but of fear twisted into familiarity. They called it a baptism, but it was a drowning. The last offering, they whispered, would close the wound, seal the salt, Let the village sleep again. They believed it. That was the worst part. They believed it. The procession moved slow through the white dusted streets, chanting hymns in broken rhythm, dragging my body like a relic too heavy for their dying arms. No one stopped them, not the salted saints, not the children carved in brine. Even Allura stood back, her hollow eyes dim with something ancient, grief or understanding. We reached the cliffs. The sea below snarled like a wound refusing to close. The tide was higher than it had ever been, as if it, too, was reaching for an end. They lifted me, and for a moment, the whole world paused, a breath between beats, a blink before judgment. "Forgive us," the priest whispered, pressing a kiss to my forehead. "No," I said, "you don't need forgiveness. You need memory." And I opened my mouth and screamed, not in pain, in command. The salted saints heard me. The sea heard me, and it answered. The rope snapped like wet paper. The stones cracked. The villagers fell back as the water surged. Not up, but out. A wall of brine rose between me and the edge of the cliff, curling in on itself like a spine awakening from centuries of slumber. And from within it, they emerged. The drowned, not statues, not children, but the souls buried in silence. They stepped onto the cliffs like soldiers returning from a war no one ever knew was happening. Their feet left no footprints. Their hands carried no weapons. But their eyes, they burned. They surrounded the villagers. No violence, only presence. And presence in this place was enough. The villagers wept, collapsed, prayed to God who had stopped listening long ago. One reached for me, a woman who had once braided my hair, and told me salt would make me holy. "Save us," she whispered. I touched her cheek. "I already did," I said. "You just kept trying to undo it." Behind me, the sea began to pull back, not in retreat, but in invitation. The drowned turned, walking calmly into the water as if finally being called home. And I followed, not because I was forced, but because this time I chose it. Allura met me at the waterline. She did not speak. She simply held out her hand. I took it. We stepped into the tide together. And as the sun rose over the broken village, the sea swallowed our shapes, not in death, not in sacrifice, in completion. Episode 13. The choir of broken mouths. They say silence is peace. But in the village, after the false baptism, silence became unbearable. Too loud, too close. It filled every corner of every room. It spilled from the mouths of children who no longer spoke. It pressed into the ears of those who survived, and it whispered back everything they never wanted to hear. Because something had returned with the tide. Not Elena, not the drowned, but memory, with a voice. It began with the choir, 12 figures, barefoot, mouths sewn shut with black thread. They stood in the chapel ruins at dusk, necks crooked toward the sky, chests heaving as if singing, yet no sound came out, until the thread broke. One by one their stitches tore, and what spilled from their mouths was not music, it was confession. I watched them tie my brother's ankles, and I said nothing. I told my daughter it was holy. I told myself she forgave me. I lit candles while they screamed. I called it faith. I buried her shoes, but not her name. Their voices echoed across the broken stones, carried by wind that no longer blew from the sea, but from within. The villagers gathered, drawn by something older than fear. They did not speak. They listened, and as they listened, they began to hear more than the voices of the choir. They began to hear their own. Confessions they had never spoken. Memories they had buried so deeply they thought the salt would keep them safe. It didn't. A man fell to his knees, sobbing as he heard his dead wife's voice spill from a child's lips. A mother clawed at her ears when her stillborn whispered to floorboards, "I remember the water. I remember your hands pushing." The village became a cathedral of guilt, and the choir sang louder, mouths open in twisted harmony, songs made from rot and regret, melodies stitched from every lie the sea had swallowed. The only one who did not weep was Allura. She walked among them, untouched. Her salt-cracked skin glowed beneath the moonlight, her eyes reflecting nothing. I don't know if she saw me. I don't know if I was really there. But I heard her say, "Confession was never meant to save you. It was meant to show you what you chose to forget." And then the bells rang again, not from the chapel, not from the tower, from the mouths of the choir. Each voice became a chime, each confession a toll. The air vibrated with truth, sharp and holy and unforgiving. And with every ring, a house collapsed, a lie unraveled, a child returned in a dream, asking why. The villagers dropped to ground, not to pray, but to crawl, as if burying their faces in the dirt could muffle the sound of their own history. It couldn't, because once you hear the choir of broken mouths, you can never go back to silence again. Episode 14. The night the sea stood still. It happened just after sunset, when the last confession bled into silence, and the choir of broken mouths fell finally, mercifully, still. The sea stopped. No waves, no tide, no breath. The ocean froze in place like a pane of black glass stretched to the edge of the world. Even the wind refused to touch it, and in that unnatural stillness, the village turned to look, first in awe, then in terror, because in that mirror-slick surface, they saw themselves, not as they were now, but as they were then. Children, mothers, priests, brothers, each frozen reflection a version of the past they had buried in silence and called survival. I stood at the cliff's edge, barefoot and salt-worn, watching the dead watch the living, and then the surface rippled, not from above, but from beneath, and from the mirror of the sea, they began to step out, one by one, not dripping, not gasping, just walking, reflections made real. A boy who had drowned at 7 walked past his grown mother, his eyes still wide with a betrayal of trust. A priest met the reflection of his own youth, a boy who once said no to the first blessing, and was beaten until he said yes. The reflections did not speak. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough. The villagers scattered, but the sea did not chase. It simply reflected. Each soul mirrored the truth its counterpart could not bear. And the truth, finally made flesh, began to undo the world. A man ran to the chapel and found it rebuilt, but made of bones. A woman opened her front door and found it full of water, the same water where she had held her daughter's head until the ritual was complete. And in the square, a child stood alone, her reflection holding her hand from beneath the glassy surface. "Which one is me?" the child asked. No one could answer. Not anymore, because the line between reflection and reality was gone, and the sea, the great, patient witness, had stopped moving, not to rest, but to reveal, to reflect every act wrapped in prayer, every silence draped in holiness, every crime disguised as covenant. Alara stood beside me again. Her voice was quiet, not cold, final. "The sea was never our judge," she said. "It was always our mirror." I nodded, because I could see it now. The greatest horror was never in what the sea demanded, but in what we gave willingly, believing ourselves righteous. The reflections did not stay. When the sun broke the horizon, they turned and walked back across the surface of the still sea, not to retreat, to rest, because truth does not need to linger, only to be seen. And for the first time in 3 centuries, the sea exhaled and began to move again. Episode 15. The New Covenant. The sea had moved again, but the village did not. Its people wandered like echoes, thin, translucent remnants of who they had been before truth had skin, before memories had hands, before silence bled into salt. There were no more priests, no more blessings, no more songs, only wind, and me. I walked the shoreline barefoot, where the tide licked at the ruins of old scripture carved into rock and bone. The salted saints no longer stood guard. They had dissolved in the night, their duty complete. Even Alara had faded. She had not spoken since the night the sea stood still. She had stepped back into the mirror, without looking behind. I knew what that meant. It was my turn. At the highest cliff, where I was once carried in ropes and stone, I stood now in full light. No chains, no hymns, only the sea waiting. But this time, not as a grave, as a mirror, and it did not speak. I did. I know why you chose me. I said aloud, because I remembered, because I refused, because I was the last who asked. Why, when everyone else said amen, the wind answered, not in words, in stillness, the kind that only comes before creation. I looked behind me. The villagers had gathered below, not to worship, not to stop me, to witness. And I held something in my hands. Not a book, not a relic, a choice. The sea would obey me now. It would bend my breath. If I asked, it would crown me. High Saint, salt-born sovereign, mother of renewal. I could lead them, could rebuild, could rewrite the covenant. This time with justice, this time with love. But then, who would they become? Another generation learning obedience, another ritual waiting to rot. So I looked at the sea and said no. I stepped back from the cliff. I placed my hand on the soil, felt it thrum, not with worship, but with life. Then I turned to the people and said the only words that mattered now. There are no more gods, only memory, only choice. Make a new one. And I walked, not into the sea, into the forest, where the salt could not reach, where stories had not yet been told. Behind me, the villagers did not cry. They knelt, not to me, but to the silence. And from that silence, something new began to grow.